Okay, so how on earth does a simple builder's tool become this powerful symbol for, absolute final judgment? That's what we're going to dig into today. We're looking at the surprisingly timeless metaphor of the plumb line. It's a whole story about measurement, integrity, and a verdict that, well, you just can't undo.
I mean, it sounds like a massive leap, doesn't it? You've got a weight on a string, and then you've got this idea of ultimate justice. But here's the thing, understanding that connection is the key. It's how we're going to see why some judgments we're seeing as totally irreversible. And to do that, we've got to start with the tool itself.
All right, first up, a simple, unforgiving tool. Before we can get to the big metaphor, we really need to understand the physical object, because its incredible power lies in just how simple it is. So, a plumb line is about as basic as it gets. It's just a weight, sometimes called a plumb bob, tied to a string. You let it hang and boom, gravity pulls it into a perfectly true vertical line. For thousands of years, this has been the go-to for builders to make sure their walls are straight. It's the ultimate, undeniable reference for what is truly upright.
So the real key here is why this thing even works. You see, a plumb line, it relies on gravity. And gravity is impartial, right? It's unchangeable. The plumb line doesn't negotiate. It doesn't give you an estimate. It just shows you the truth, plain and simple. A wall is either straight or it isn't. There's just no middle ground. And that absolute, totally unforgiving nature, that's what makes it such an incredible symbol. So, we've got this simple, absolute tool. Now let's jump to our second section, the vision of Amos. This is where our ordinary builder's instrument makes a really dramatic appearance back in an 8th century BCE prophecy. In a vision, the prophet Amos is shown a plumb line, but right away its whole purpose gets flipped on its head. This isn't about building something new, it's about inspecting what's already standing. The tool's function has been completely redefined, from creation to evaluation.
And then you get this incredibly powerful statement. The plumb line is being placed right in the middle of the nation. Suddenly, the thing being measured isn't a stone wall anymore. It's the very integrity of a society. The standard is now being applied to people.
Which brings us to our third part, measuring a nation's integrity. This is where the metaphor just comes roaring to life, because the structure being inspected is now an entire society.
And here's the central conflict. You have the plumb line, that perfect vertical, representing the divine standard, things like justice, righteousness, and truth. But when it's held up against the nation, what it reveals is a crooked wall. It exposes a society built on a foundation of injustice and oppression. The deviation was just clear as day.
The measurement didn't just find a few cosmetic cracks here and there. No, it revealed that the crookedness was foundational. The entire structure of the society was out of alignment. The problem wasn't just that people were behaving badly, it's that the whole thing was built badly from the ground up. So when a structure is that fundamentally flawed, what's the next step? Well, that leads us to section 4, the verdict. And in this vision, it's a pretty grim one. Think about it like this. Let's say a structural engineer comes out to inspect a building and finds these huge, deep cracks in the foundation. I mean, cracks that are beyond repair. They're not going to say, oh, just slap a new coat of paint on it. No way. They're going to condemn the entire building. The problem is just too deep to fix with some cosmetic touch-up, and that's exactly the kind of logic being applied here.
See, this verdict isn't presented as something random or emotional. It's the final step in a very logical process. First, a standard was set. Second, a measurement was taken. Third, the flaw was identified as structural. And from there, the conclusion was inevitable. The structure was beyond repair.
Which brings us to our final and most important section. The real core of this whole thing. Why was the judgment final? Why were there no more chances? The vision wraps up with this chillingly final statement. To pass by in this context meant to overlook, to forgive, to spare. So this phrase, it signifies the end of all of that. The time for overlooking the flaws was officially over. And the story implies this wasn't some sudden decision. Not at all. There had been tons of warnings, plenty of opportunities for the nation to correct its course. The plumb line wasn't the first test. It was the final measurement, coming only after all those other warnings had failed. And at that point, the chance for reform just dropped to zero. So ultimately, the judgment was final because the problem was one of being, not just doing. This wasn't about correcting a series of bad actions anymore. The measurement revealed that the nation's fundamental identity, its very structure, was crooked. And you just can't fix a broken foundation by asking it to act straight. So this ancient metaphor, it kind of leaves us with a really provocative question for our own time, doesn't it?
What are those non-negotiable standards? You know, the plumb lines that we use to measure ourselves, our institutions, our whole societies. And maybe more importantly, what do we do when we find out that the very structures we've built are fundamentally completely out of alignment?